So kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to our webinar for the proposed district plan changes. My name is Katie McRae. I'm the Head of Communications and Engagement at Council. Thank you very much for taking part in this event. Webinars are a bit of a new avenue of engagement for us, not only because of the COVID impacts, but also because we want to offer residents more ways of engaging with us, and hopefully we can connect with more people across the city and around the peninsula. Because this is a new forum for our team, please bear with us if there are a few bumps along the way. So, bit of an agenda for tonight. Tonight we're going to be taking you through the proposed heritage plan change in residential character areas from the Housing and Business Choice Plan change. But first I'd like to introduce the team and working behind the screen and let you know how you can participate even though your mics and cameras are turned off. Then I'll hand over to our planners. He'll explain the proposed changes and why these are happening. They'll run through the new heritage items in areas in Christchurch and what this means for you as property owners. So tonight you're going to be hearing from Ike, Glenda and Amanda, who are subject matter experts. And guys, can I get you to turn on your cameras just so we can see you there? And we also have Kieran and Sam working hard behind the scenes to keep this session running smoothly. So your mics and cameras are switched off so that we can keep the session moving, but if you're using the Microsoft Teams app, you can use the Q&A function by clicking the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. Thanks very much for the questions that you've supplied during the registration. We've already added some of these questions in with their answers, and you should be able to see them in the side of your screen there under Q&As. We'll also be taking question breaks throughout the session, so if you're busy listening, you don't need to try to type and listen at the same time. So the Q&A is only available if you have downloaded the app, but if you haven't, you can email questions through to engagement@ccc.govt.nz and we'll be monitoring that as well. And if we can't answer some of those questions tonight, we'll be taking them away and providing answers as part of the follow-up and closing the loop on this meeting. If you're on the app, you can also react, thumbs up, thumbs down to some of the questions and answers in the Q&A section. And you can also use the reaction tab at the top of your screen to respond to what's being said during the presentation. If you're hard of hearing or if you're experiencing some sound issues, you can turn on live captions. Just click on those three small dots at the more top of your screen and click on Turn on Live Captions, which is near the bottom of that drop-down list. So one last thing from me, hopefully the banner has come up to let you know that this session is being recorded. This will be made available to you and shared on our website in the next few days. So I'll now hand over to Ike to start the presentation.
Kia ora koutou everyone. Like Katie said, my name is Ike Kleinboss. I'm part of the city planning team here at Christchurch City Council, and I am leading the residential aspects and qualifying matters work regarding to the housing and business choice plan change that we are underway with at the moment. Next slide. So as people will no doubt be aware, our city is growing and demands are changing for both what people need and what people want in terms of different lifestyles as well. The government direction to give effect to this has been made pretty explicit now through what's known as the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, or otherwise known as the NPSUD, and also recent changes made to the Resource Management Act, coming through the Enabling Housing and Supply and Other Matters legislation that came into effect very late last year. So the work that we've got currently underway is really an opportunity for us to realise how and where we grow, giving effect to this larger piece of national legislation. Next slide, please. So what this means in practice is that at a fundamental level, there's been an introduction of what's known as medium density residential standards, otherwise known as MDRS. And what this means, amongst many other things, is that at a minimum across all urban residential zones, housing of up to 12 metres high, or about 3 stories in height, is made possible across all of those urban residential zones. and can be done with up to 3 houses per section as well. And if that is achieved in concert with all of the other controls that are being proposed through MDRS regulation as well, then that can be achieved without resource consent. Council has a requirement to implement this as part of the recent changes to the Act. And this has to be seen alongside the changes that were made through NPSUD, National Policy Statement for Urban Development, which was gazetted in 2020, and Council must also give effect to in a similar time frame to the MDRS piece of legislation that came in through the Act late last year. And what the NPS UD aspects of the plan change or legislation means is that effectively it requires further intensification, specifically around commercial centres and within those, and also within and around the CBD as well. Changes to government legislation as well also mean that the process for neighbour approval or notification is also relaxed quite significantly, and also rules for subdivision are also required to change. So what that effectively means is that the discretion that council has to manage subdivision is very much limited really only to vacant allotment subdivisions. So when I guess new lots are created without any houses, then we have the ability to direct minimum allotment sizes. However, when it comes to existing dwellings or any proposed dwellings that are done as part of development, we cannot direct any minimum allotment size. And that is across the board for all of those urban residential zones. The only real means that we have to nuance or adjust any of this direction is really what's known as through qualifying matters. In other words, areas that are unsuitable or inappropriate to achieve the intensification direction overall. Next slide. So in terms of the overall scope, the map here on the left is trying to show at a spatial point really what is within scope in terms of what we say the urban environment. So it's trying to highlight all of the applicable residential and commercial zones across Christchurch where this intensification direction needs to apply, noting that is at different scales across that area as well. So as part of the scope for this housing and business choice plan change, what's within scope is, like I said, all of those areas within that urban environment, all the residential zones, as well as those commercial centres and their surrounds as well. And there's also the ability to adjust associated controls, such as, like I said, subdivision and things related to fencing, engineering, access, and other related matters for intensification and development. In terms of what's outside of scope, that really is anything that is outside of the urban environment. So what that means is that we aren't reviewing rural zones, and we aren't rezoning new greenfield areas. It is really fundamentally a rehousing of existing urban residential and commercial areas where applicable to seek to intensify and give effect to the government direction. We're also not looking at what's known as non-residential activities. So, for example, what we call home occupation businesses, or a business that's running out of a home. The controls associated with that aren't deemed to be as part of the overall direction from the legislation that we have to give effect to. So they're outside of the scope for the housing and business choice plan change. Next slide. The process to give effect or make decisions on the overall intensification direction is also prescribed through the various pieces of legislation. And what this effectively means is that there is a condensed, highly condensed 12-month process really from formal notification to seek to come to fruition. So the direction from central government is that council was required to formally notify the proposal by the 20th of August this year, and upon notification, certain aspects of the intensification direction do have immediate legal effect, most notably the MDRS, or the Medium Density Residential Standards. So that basically means that from notification, the parts that enable 3 stories and up to 3 units per site have immediate legal effect upon notification. And once again, that's through that national piece of legislation as well. From that point, the regulation really says that there's a 20 working day window, or about a month, for council really to receive formal submissions on the proposal. Council is then required to synthesise all of the submissions received and provide a summary of those submissions that are also open for public feedback. And that second process is really trying to target those who are involved in the first tranche of feedback, the formal submission process. So it really highlights the need to be engaged earlier on and early on to provide feedback from the public as well. In terms of deliberating on the proposal, not only from council but also on submissions received, that has to be done through what's known as an independent hearings panel, or an IHP, which is made up of a group of suitably qualified experts that sit outside of council, who oversee, like I said, submissions received and also supporting evidence and how council intends to respond to those submissions as well. The hearings panel is required to not only hear all of that in a formal open process, but also draft up the recommended decision, which has to be presented to council. And council needs to deliberate on that and affirm or otherwise that recommendation by the 20th of August next year. So like I said, it is a 12-month process. In the event where council doesn't agree with some or all of the recommendation, then those elements will go to the Minister for the Environment, and the Minister really has the final say when it comes to how that's being given effect to, and that really has to have been concluded once again by the 20th of August 2023. So this is an extremely condensed time frame, very much central government directed upon all larger councils across New Zealand. So this specific piece of legislation affects the likes of Greater Christchurch, Wellington, Hamilton, Auckland and Tauranga, and all the associated councils around those urban areas as well. Next slide, please.
So we now got to one of our question slides. Just wondering if anyone has any questions about the government legislation before we go on any further. We are getting a couple of questions through on other matters, and we are endeavouring to answer them in the Q&A, and you should see them popping up fairly shortly. Just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, just to do so by clicking on the Q&A at the top of your screen and entering it that way. So we'll just pause for a very short period here just to let you type any questions that you might have, and then we'll get underway with the rest of the presentation. Let's kick on. There will be opportunities later in the presentation to continue to ask questions, so this isn't your only opportunity, rest assured. So guys, if you'd like to continue with the presentation.
Great, thanks Katie. Okay, so as part of Council's process to evaluate giving effect to this intensification direction, one of the elements that we are proposing to carry over is residential character areas as a qualifying matter. I'll just talk about how we're going through that and how that looks as part of the proposal. So next slide, please. So like I said, we can use qualifying matters to reduce intensification in some areas, but they aren't a way to negate all intensification. So Council is still very much required to evaluate how it can give effect to those increases in heights, regardless of whether or not there is a qualifying matter. The analysis may very well show that a very limited or no giving effect to that intensification is appropriate, but nonetheless the evaluation needs to be done. So it shows that there's still a very high threshold for Council to go through to include a qualifying matter and provide that evidence to justify reducing the intensification direction overall. Next slide, please. So in terms of what is a qualifying matter, like I said, it's very much prescribed by the Act. So the prescribed elements are really any what's called matters of national importance, which are captured under Section 6 of the Act, and also any features relating to larger national policy statements, relating to nationally significant infrastructure, public open space, heritage orders, designations, any legislation that needs to give effect to iwi participation, and anything relating to having to give effect to demand for low density business demand as well. So it really much highlights that there is a national significance focus overall for the matters that are prescribed, as you can see there on the left column. In terms of those other matters, there is the avenue available for Council to also include other matters as qualifying matters, but they can only do so if they are seen to be as inappropriate to achieving intensification, subject to meeting the requirements under the Act. So as I said before, it does require quite a high burden of proof to be able to be progressed as an other qualifying matter. Firstly, the characteristic of the feature that you're evaluating needs to be evaluated against the national significance direction for housing and business intensification, again linking to that national significance narrative overall in the legislation. A site-specific evaluation needs to be undertaken to identify where those specific characteristics highlight where decreased level of intensification or height should be progressed, and so that really must highlight really at a, once again, site-specific level where those matters apply. So it means really that if we're doing a larger area, we simply cannot evaluate it based on its sum of all its parts. We need to evaluate it at a compartmentalised level, which obviously is quite a high bar and burden of proof. The cost-benefit analysis also needs to be undertaken as part of any of the work that Council does to give effect through a plan change, and that's both through economic and real costs and benefits of reducing intensification in those specific areas as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of our proposal, we are looking to carry over most of the constraint features that are identified in the current district plan. So that includes the likes of outstanding natural features, landscapes, ecologically significant areas of vegetation, heritage, cultural features and the like. Specific areas protecting utilities and infrastructure, for example, railway, the port, airport and state highway as well. And then also high natural risk areas as well, so particularly in regards to rockfall, slope hazards, tsunami inundation, and high flood risk as well. And just noting the fact that it is really just focusing on high natural hazard risk, and this is by virtue once again of the legislation which directs that we have to give effect to that national significance or matters of national importance, which highlight that there has to be a protection around only significant natural hazard risk overall as well. So in terms of new matters that we are considering, we are proposing to introduce a new 400 volt power line setback around, I guess what traditionally known as, just power lines down the road. And that's really to ensure their continued safe and efficient operation in light of the increased heights that would otherwise abut those lines as well. Littleton City Port Depot in Hillsborough as well, just noting the hours of operation there and some of the acoustic effects that could be encountered by increased intensification around that area. Residential heritage areas as well, as we'll hear about shortly through Plan Change 13, new items and settings, and also radio corridors as well, which is from the Justice and Emergency Services Precinct to ensure that emergency radio network still remains in operation in light of any intensification that may come online around those areas as well. And coastal hazards work, which some of you may know about, which is also out for engagement as part of the overarching program from Council as well. The other matters that we are proposing to carry over are residential character areas. And so residential character areas are not prescribed, like in the previous slide, not prescribed by legislation, and so council is very much required to treat those as an other qualifying matter. And once again, there's that high burden of proof as well. And that same level of proof is also required for capturing where there is infrastructure insufficiency, such as the vacuum sewer constraints area, and also some of the schedule of protected trees as well. Not all, but a significant proportion of the protected trees also need to be carried over as other qualifying matters as well. Next slide, please. So like I said, this has been done alongside a variety of other plan changes, which is trying to, I guess, address some of the qualifying matters aspects. So like I said, the draft coastal hazards plan change as well. Plan change 12 is being progressed for coastal inundation and erosion, and the draft heritage plan change, which we'll hear about in a moment as well, and the draft radio communication pathways, which is the airspace around the Justice Precinct as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of character areas being addressed as a qualifying matter, like I said, we are cognizant of the high evidential threshold and for that to be addressed alongside the matter of national importance under the Act. To date, what we have done is largely or commissioned a desktop assessment of the current existing residential character areas. And the intention really is that there will be a second phase of the work following an engagement period to really flesh out that on a site-by-site level and also to be able to address any other areas that are nominated as potential new residential character areas as part of this process as well. The methodology that we're using to evaluate that builds on what was successful through the replacement district plan process because we know that it is justifiable as an evidence basis going forward. And so fundamentally what that means is a threshold of 80% needs to be achieved for a wider area. 50% of those need to be identified as primary sites, with the remaining 30% being identified as contributory sites as well. And that analysis is led by a team of expert urban designers, landscape architects and planners, and once again needs to be conducted on a site-by-site level of assessment as well. Next slide, please. So, like I said, we've commissioned Boffa School to do a piece of work to evaluate the existing residential character areas. And this is just an example from the reporting that has been made available on the Plan Change 14 website. So what you can see here is an example of two residential character areas, and the colours really seek to represent where there are areas that are primary, being blue of the highest, I guess, calibre, contributory and green. There's not too many of those, so it's not as easy enough to see. Neutral as well, so they don't contribute, and also intrusive, where they detract from character as well. And so as a result of this, an evaluation has been done about the boundary of the overall sum of those parcels and how that looks overall from a new potential area and what can be carried over and justified through this, this new lens through intensification direction that we have to give effect to. Next slide, please. The character areas are also shown on our online mapping portal as well, which has all the other zones that we've proposed as well. And so this looks slightly different from what we have in the PDF reporting, so just talk through some of that. So what we can see here on the left is where there is a difference between what is currently within the district plan and what is being proposed to go forward, as in the sites that still have merit or are able to meet the criteria of character going forward. So the blue areas are really the ones that at this stage are proposed to still have integrity as a character area, whereas the lighter kind of purple areas, targeted towards the bottom part mainly, showing where it has been proposed that would be removed because it simply doesn't meet the criteria of character areas going forward in terms of contributory, primary or neutral. There are also areas that we have shown on the map where there are heritage areas over top, so that's shown on the right there, and that has the blue areas with the black dot around it as well, and that's where we have areas where there are character areas as well as heritage over top as well. So just to highlight that there are a few areas where that exists as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of how the reporting has concluded to date, the table on the right there is a brief summary of the 15 residential character areas we have within the district plan and how they're being proposed to go forward as part of this intensification plan change. So there are a number that are proposed to be reduced. Most are finessing around the edges. There are some which are slightly larger, like the Beckenham Loop area, and there are 2 areas as well that are proposed to be removed. And this is fundamentally because those areas have either been developed in a way that is intrusive or isn't contributing to the character area, or existing buildings have since been demolished as well, presumably following settlement from insurance claims after the district plan process was completed as well. So like I said, phase 2 will seek to validate that at a site-by-site level. So the information that we have released is, like I said, draft at this stage, and we are seeking feedback on how we have considered that and where there are other areas as well that we should be considering that aren't already captured within the district plan. Next slide, please. In terms of the controls going forward, like I said, we still need to consider how intensification is enabled as part of this plan change process. So each one of those areas has been evaluated in terms of saying, well, what is actually suitable when the baseline from MDRS is 3 stories, 3 units, what is really deemed to be suitable in terms of best giving effect to the overall direction. So the table below is really a very quick summary of some of the controls. It's definitely not all, but some of the controls for the character areas that we're proposed to go forward and how that really is nuanced. So it shows that there's quite a large variety of different controls based on the different areas. So it's also trying to highlight that it isn't really a carte blanche exercise in terms of saying, hey, it's been identified as a character area. That means no intensification is possible. For example, within the Dudley or Beckenham area, you can still conduct, a 2-story development covering 40% of the site, which is larger than what it currently is, and also do 2 dwellings on a site as well. So it doesn't increase it overall, but other areas where it is more sensitive, for example, the Ranfurly area, there's a limit of 1 story or 5.5 metres, maintaining the same site coverage and also the same setback as well. So consent will still be very much required for any new or relocated dwellings within these areas. Fencing and walls will also be controlled, and consent will be required. It's what's known as a restricted discretionary activity, and so that does increase the activity status from what is there currently. Effectively, the current activity status for resource consenting within those areas is fairly permissive. So much so that subject to meeting the standards that are directed in the Act, Council must approve the resource consent application as a controlled activity. Through restricted discretionary, it means that discretion that council has to control the outcomes is enhanced. So we recognise that it could be improved in terms of maintaining those character areas going forward. So we have increased the discretion that we have to ensure that's happened, and we also have the ability to decline consents as well within those areas if they don't meet the overarching objectives and policies as well that are associated with those character areas. Next slide.
So we're through to another question slide, and we know we've got some coming in. We've also getting some via email, because we realise that not all of you have the app, and therefore the Q&A function won't work. However, if you email us at engagement@ccc.govt.nz, we are monitoring that inbox and trying to respond to you as part of that, either verbally or in email. We are getting a lot of questions, so look, I'm really sorry if we aren't getting to everyone's question. If it doesn't get answered tonight as part of this presentation, it will be answered as part of the notes that are sent out on this webinar. But I do, so we do have a couple which I believe we would like to talk to now. Are we in a position, team, to be able to answer a couple of the questions verbally? Ike, I think there's something waiting there for you.
Yeah, I do see one that's there for me to respond to verbally. So the question was around, do the qualifying matters excluding the areas from the MDRS standards also have immediate legal effect in August? The short answer is somewhat. What it effectively means is those areas that are identified as being within a qualifying matter won't have MDRS enabled at notification, and the existing operative district plan controls that are within the district plan at the moment will be carried over as they are. So effectively, how that will be dealt with is through the hearing process, and wherever the hearing process resolves itself in August next year, at that time, then it will have legal effect. So the Act recognises that where there are areas that are proposed to be qualifying matters, there is effectively, I guess, a dispute in terms of rationale for nuancing that intensification. And so that's why when there is a qualifying matter, MDRS does not apply within those areas, and it simply defaults to existing controls in the district plan. Go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to say, just doing another quick double check, team. Are there any other ones that we can answer verbally now while we we've also got some written ones that are appearing, but if there's anything else that we can answer verbally now, otherwise we will continue on with the presentation. Just to reiterate, if you're not getting your question answered in the Q&A, and because you can't see it, we will be making the questions available after the presentation, and they will be answered. And I'm sorry, it's obviously not everyone is able to do that, but we are also monitoring the engagement inbox, and you can send your questions through there. So should we kick on with the rest of the presentation?
Great, so we'll hand over to Glenda to lead the heritage aspects of the plan change.
Thanks, Ike. Kia ora koutou. I'm Glenda Dixon. I'm a senior policy planner in the city planning team. And I also have Amanda Owes here, who's a senior heritage advisor in our heritage team. So she'll be able to answer all the questions that I can't, hopefully. First slide. The important thing for heritage is that it's a matter of national importance under the RMA, and therefore it's a qualifying matter for the NPSUD, as Ike has just been explaining. And what that means is that the amount of intensification that we have to provide for on heritage sites and in heritage areas can be reduced. So today, in talking about the draft heritage plan change, there are several components to that. We've proposed some new buildings and items to be added to the schedule of significant historic heritage. We've proposed that there be some new interiors of buildings added to that schedule. And we are proposing 11 residential heritage areas, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. There are also other elements of the heritage plan change that are not related to the NPSUD, and for example, those include things like amendments to the heritage rules and quite a number of corrections, particularly to the schedule. Next slide, please. So the first thing, the first component of the plan change is the new buildings and items. So we're proposing to add about 40 new listings to that schedule of significant historic heritage. The heritage team has been aware for some time that the current district plan heritage listings do not represent all aspects of the city's history and development, and this adding of new listings will help that, and will also help implement the council's Our City, Our Taonga heritage strategy, which the council adopted in 2019. So the new listings include some surviving buildings in and around the fringes of the CBD, and a few private buildings in suburban areas, several council-owned halls and cemeteries, and nearly all the remaining batches at Taylor's Mistake that are not already scheduled. And those photos there include, as you can see, the Sydenham Cemetery, the Yildhurst Memorial Hall, and that's a picture of the Public Trust building, which has been recently renovated. That one was actually deleted from the proposed heritage schedule during the last district plan review at the request of the previous property owner, but it's now being proposed to be reinstated on that schedule. Next slide, please. So new interiors proposed for protection. There are about 25 of these, and 9 of them are part of the new listings, and 16 interiors for the existing listings. So those ones have the exteriors already protected, but we're adding the interiors. So best practice heritage management is to recognise and protect the whole of a building or place, and that'll be the default position going forward when we add new listings. This doesn't mean that it's not possible to do anything. It's still possible to do maintenance and minor repairs to scheduled interiors without resource consent. Next slide. Oh, actually, I should tell you about those photos. You might know that the first one is the interior of the Hare Memorial Library at Christ College, and the second one is the interior of the Nio Marsh House in Kashmir, and those ones are part of the 25. Next slide, please. Questions. Do we have any questions about new buildings or items or new interiors? Shall I just carry on, Katie?
Just double checking with the team, is there anything that we can respond to verbally while we've during this time, or is it mostly stuff that's going to be coming up in Q&A chat? We'll just continue on for the moment, and we have another question opportunity at the end.
Okay, thank you. This slide is about character areas and residential heritage areas and what's the difference between them, which is something that I think a lot of people have found quite confusing. We've tried to distinguish between the two so that character areas have a focus on coherence of character and things like patterns of subdivision, open space and streetscape, and the scale and appearance of buildings. And residential heritage areas have additional heritage values as distinctive and significant residential environments, which represent important aspects of the city's history. So what we've called RHAs as an abbreviation have a coherent story or a shared history. So only some character areas have this additional layer of shared history, in which case there might also be a proposed RHA for the same or similar area. And some RHAs are not character areas because they're much more diverse in character. So there's kind of effectively three categories: areas which are character areas only, areas that are residential heritage areas only, and areas that might happen to be both. If it comes to a property which is in both areas, if you want to make changes to it, you would only need one application for resource consent rather than two. So the whole thing would be done as one. Next slide, please. So as I've said, residential heritage areas are areas with distinctive and significant residential environments. They include buildings and features which collectively, rather than individually, are of significance to the city's heritage and identity. They provide an historical narrative of the residential development of areas in Christchurch. So they span quite a number of decades of history. Back in 2010, we, through staff and consultants, did quite a lot of work on residential heritage areas as a concept, and 89 candidate areas were looked at to identify RHAs, and of those, 12 were fully researched and assessed as potentially representative areas. But post-earthquakes, this work had to be put on hold for a future update due to the degree of demolition and damage in the city as a whole and within these areas. That update hasn't been able to occur till the last year or two, so quite a bit of update was done in 2021 and it's now being finished in 2022. It's been established that the criteria that were used back in 2010 are still fit for purpose. Next slide, please. So of the original 89 possible areas reviewed back in 2010, the vast majority of those don't meet the criteria or don't meet them anymore. They're not sufficiently intact, or there's too much new development. And on top of that, we also had several new areas investigated. So at this point, we've got 11 RHAs now proposed, and each of them have, in fact, an overall heritage report that will be available at notification stage, and each of them will have individual property record forms and assessment. And in the case of Littleton, it's such a large area that it will actually be street by street, but for all the other areas, there'll be individual property record forms. And the properties will be categorised as defining, contributory, neutral or intrusive. And we can explain that a bit more if need be. And I think one of the answers to one of the questions was what makes something defining. Anyway, the categories affect the proposed rules that apply. And as I've said, some of the areas overlap with character areas, but they're not the same. RHAs have those additional heritage values and they may be more diverse in character. Next slide, please. So here are the main criteria for what makes a residential heritage area. There are a few other criteria, but this is a distillation of the main ones. They make a significant contribution to the district's sense of place and identity. It's a group of interrelated heritage places, buildings, structures and sites with clear geographic boundaries. They collectively meet the same heritage significance criteria as we have in the district plan already for individually scheduled items, and there's a moderate to high degree of authenticity and integrity. So finally on that slide, the areas have to contain a majority of sites and buildings that are of defining or contributory importance. So the top two of those four categories that I mentioned previously. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to pass over to Amanda Owes, who's going to tell you a little bit about the heritage values of two examples of our proposed residential heritage areas. And this is the sort of information that will be available for all of them at notification stage. But before I pass over to Amanda, I'll just explain the colours of the map on the right and for the equivalent map on the next slide. So blue is for being of defining importance to the character of that or the heritage of that area, and green is for being of contributory importance. So this particular one, as Amanda will explain, is the Pico Shand RHA. So looking at that map on the right hand side, there's a majority of blue and green, so that's showing that it meets the criteria for being a residential heritage area. So now I'll pass over to Amanda Ows, and she'll be able to tell you a little bit more about these examples.
Thanks, Glenda. And there have been a few questions about what the heritage values of some of the different areas are, so we'll be able to answer that on at least two of the areas just now. Pico Shand State Housing Area was built in 1939 to 41, and it illustrates the early history of state housing in Christchurch. This particular state housing area in the city is actually notable New Zealand-wide for its very comprehensive planning, which was aimed at promoting good health and a strong sense of community. And what you're looking at on the left is an early subdivision plan of the area. So we've had historical research done to identify the history and the heritage values. And we've also had a look on site, which has confirmed for us that a majority of original houses, along with the street layout, reserves, tree plantings, pedestrian walkways, the corner store, the plunket rooms, and also the openness of the properties to the street all remain intact, and that was part of the original design. So that area has those values that Glenda talked about, the heritage significance criteria, that's historical, social, architectural, contextual, and other values. And we'll go to the next one, please. So the other example we have for you tonight is the Wayside Avenue proposed heritage area in Burnside, and this reflects the next phase in housing development in the city, moving on from the state housing area. Now this was about government supporting low-income people to own their own quality homes through the group housing scheme and low-interest loans. So it's part of the story of residential development in the city. It dates from the 1950s, and in 1957, Wayside Avenue was the first of this type of development in Christchurch to be promoted through the nationwide public exhibition, which was called the Parade of Homes. So the decorated and furnished houses reflected the work of local builders and architects, showcased modern design and materials, and also local homewares of local businesses such as Ballantyne's. The street was open for a week, and in that time 80,000 people visited the street and all the houses sold. So it's quite a social occasion in the culture of our city. It's quite important. And the street retains a high degree of intactness today, as you can see from that coloured mapping, as Glenda explained. And next slide, please. I'll hand back to Glenda.
Hi again. Since the RHAs have been carefully defined and we want to keep whatever heritage values are left, there shouldn't be too much scope for intensification. For example, we've generally already excluded rear sites that are not visible from the street, so they don't make much of a contribution to the streetscape or the overall perception of heritage values in the area. Intensification could easily result in loss of heritage value, as you can imagine. For example, where heritage value is associated with the degree of openness, and that's true probably of the Pico Shand example that we talked about first. And where the heritage is associated with the style of the houses. For example, the St Albans area, south of Melbourne Park, Gossip, Carrington, Jacob Streets, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide is basically the sort of questions that people probably want to ask about what does this mean for me if I own property within one of these residential heritage areas. And on the left-hand side, I've listed the sorts of things that you're going to potentially need resource consent for as a restricted discretionary activity, which is what Ike was explaining before. And on the right, there are exceptions to that. So on the left, we would generally require consent for new buildings, additions and alterations to building exteriors, not to interiors, and for new fences and walls over 1.5 metres in height. So taller fences and walls that basically block views of the houses. And for demolition of defining or contributory buildings, those two highest categories. But we wouldn't be interested in regulating buildings behind the main residential unit on the site that are less than 5 metres in height. So that's sort of garages and such. Well, I mean, detached garages is probably what I should have said, and things like sheds. Alterations and additions to exteriors of neutral or intrusive buildings. We're not too bothered about those if they're not visible from the street. And we don't really think it's justifiable to be concerned about fences and walls on side and rear boundaries. So we're only focusing on front fences. Buildings on rear sites, I've talked a little bit about that already. Basically, where they are still in the RHAs, they wouldn't require consent for development on them. In demolition of neutral or intrusive buildings, that's sort of, for our purposes, no big deal. But if you are wanting to put a new building in, we would like to see that that has at least some sympathy with the heritage values of the area. So that sort of flicks back into the left-hand column. Next slide, please. Okay. So, any questions? I think there have been a few, haven't there, Katie?
Yes, we do have plenty of questions coming in, both on email, and I am trying to respond to them. If I haven't been able to respond to your question on email, it means you'll be receiving a separate response after this webinar. We'll just give you a little bit of time to put through any more questions that you might have via the Q&A box, and I just want to test with the team if there's anything that we would like to answer verbally at this point.
There was a question, I think, about Caudron Avenue in Wigram. I think that may have been answered in writing. There was actually also a question about where can we find out what category our property falls into in a residential heritage area, and that will be information that will be available when we notify the plan change. Each of the areas will have an overall heritage report, and that will list on a site-by-site basis what category the property has been assessed as being within, and that's based on the advice of a professional heritage consultant. So sitting behind that will be a property report for each of those, or record really, for each of those sites, which we will be able to also make available on request.
Glenda, I do have a question for you. Littleton already has character overlay for much of the central township, requiring a resource consent for any works. So why does the entire Littleton need to be within the proposed residential heritage area in addition to this? Are you able to respond to that one for us?
Yeah, it's a bit of a work in progress. The character area in Littleton hasn't actually been reviewed again in this last round of work, and I can perhaps talk to that as well. But it's quite a lot smaller than the residential heritage area, as you've alluded to. The residential heritage area that we've proposed is based on the Heritage New Zealand area of registration as a historic area, which is the bulk of Littleton. Actually, that particular map was that was mapped in 2009, so there's a potential need to update the boundaries slightly. At the minute, we've got the heritage consultant that I was mentioning, who's just recently been out looking at the edges of the Littleton township, and has noted that some of those areas would probably end up being in a neutral category rather than defining or contributory. So that's sort of a choice that we've got to make soon as to whether or not we try and shrink the area slightly on the edges, or leave all of it in the residential heritage area and just categorise some of those streets as neutral rather than defining or contributory.
I have another verbal question here. What will change around subdivision within the proposed residential heritage areas?
Again, that's a bit of a work in progress, partly because we've drafted rules for the residential heritage areas, which are actually in the plan change document that's in the technical information for plan change 13. At the minute, they don't include specific subdivision rules. That was partly because we're waiting to see how the subdivision rules are rewritten as a result of the medium density residential standards, and also the collapsing of, I think we've got 10 residential zones in Christchurch into a basic 2 with a few additional overlays. So the residential heritage areas actually at the moment all have, well, not all have the different zonings, but a number of them have different zonings that go from residential suburban right up to residential medium density, and residential hills and so forth. And each of those current zones has slightly different subdivision standards. So we're going to have a good look at that in terms of what sort of intensification, as we've said before, we can provide for, because obviously if you subdivide, you can probably you'll be doing that to put in another house. So we're going to have to look carefully at that as part of the examination of further intensification prospects in these areas.
I've also got another one for the team. If our property is within a proposed residential heritage area, will a resource consent be mandatory for any new residential buildings on the site? Because obviously there would be additional costs for this that the owner would have to bear. Could someone in the team answer that one for me, please?
Did you say any additional buildings?
If our property is within the proposed residential heritage area, will a resource consent be mandatory for any new residential buildings on the site?
Oh, yeah. Yes. In terms of a restricted discretionary consent, which is a sort of what we as planners describe as a reasonably low level of resource consent. So council's discretion is limited to matters that we have to list, and essentially it'll be just effect on the heritage values of that area. Yeah, that's probably the answer.
Okay. Thank you. And another one that's come through, is there a hierarchy between character and heritage areas in terms of district plan controls? Does heritage being mentioned as a national significance in the RMA elevate heritage areas above character areas for protection enhancement purposes? Would you like to answer that one, Ike?
Yes, probably a good one for both Glenn and I to cover off, but I'll start off, I guess, just by saying that in terms of how the legislation recognises the national significance, absolutely priority is given to heritage overall, because it is captured under the Act as a matter of national importance. However, the way that Council's going about it, by virtue of including residential character areas as an other qualifying matter, the consenting regime is, I think from my point of view, the way that we've proposed at least, quite comparable between the two. So I wouldn't necessarily say there is a discrepancy in terms of the hierarchy overall, but just noting that that's by virtue of council choosing to carry over, if you will, residential character areas as another qualifying matter. Do you think you'd agree with that, Glenda, in terms of controls overall at restricted discretionary?
Well, that's the proposal, isn't it, for character areas, that you elevate the sort of status of the controls to restricted discretionary as well. So, the controls for each will be quite similar. But having said that, heritage is actually a matter of national importance under the RMA, so that gives it sort of automatic qualifying matter status, whereas the character area is not, or character areas are not. So you have to actually provide the evidence to back that up, that character areas should also be qualifying matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we've talked about, the evidence threshold for those character areas is substantially higher overall, just because of the site-by-site level of assessment that's needed, and the other associated evaluations in terms of ground truthing that against the national significance direction of intensification for both housing and business. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
I've also got a question that's come up on the email just regarding waterways and streams. Will these be considered as qualifying matters? And if so, will it be the existing district plan guidelines? So that's a 10-metre setback.
Yeah, I can answer that. So that's absolutely one that we are seeking to carry over in terms of the existing district plan controls. So as they've summarised it, that's pretty much bang on in terms of what we are proposing. The draft mapping that we have released in our interactive web map shows spatially all of the different waterways that we are carrying over as qualifying matters, and that really does seek to reflect the controls in the existing district plan in terms of the prescribed setbacks there as well.
Just flicking through a couple more questions now. I do have an answer to the Cauldron Street question that was answered via email, and I'm just going to read this out. So this street is in a proposed heritage area, Wigram. The heritage significance lies in its historic and social value for its association with the Wigram airbase. Architectural values are demonstrated in the range of housing that was designed in the late 1930s by the government, and then purpose-built to house military personnel. And we can provide more detail on the heritage values outside of this webinar for you. And I just have another one that's popped up on screen too, guys, and I'm sorry to throw it to you, but will the IHP decide whether any, some or all character areas can be considered as qualifying matters?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So I guess effectively it's all, because at the end of the day, the IHP will have to consider all of the evidence from all matters. So it's not just qualifying matters, but also how council considers it suitable to give effect to the intensification direction, also against submissions received as well. So there's, fair to say, quite a burden on the IHP to consider all of the evidence that's presented, and once again a fairly condensed time frame.
Thanks, Ike. Glenda, just a point of clarification. The details of which homes are heritage proposed will be supplied at point of notification, is that correct? Is that the same for character and other designations? Because the person would like to know why this isn't available now as part of the consultation.
We could have made some of it available now, but we didn't have each of the 11 areas completely finished. So we wanted to sort of be consistent in terms of each having exactly the same level of information, and sort of checking reports against each other to make sure they're consistent in approach. Yeah, so it was just because we didn't quite have it finished in time, but that work is nearly complete.
Look, we do have one final opportunity at the end of the presentation for some questions. We might just kick on with the last remaining slides if we could, please. So just encouraging you to have your say. We're looking for feedback until the 13th of May. There are 4 plan changes that you can provide feedback on, and on the next slide you can see we have the draft housing and business choice plan change, and with qualifying matters. We also have the draft coastal hazards plan change, draft heritage plan change, and the draft radio communications pathway plan change. All information about this can be found if you go to ccc.govt.nz/have your say. Ike, handing over to you.
Great, next slide, please. So like we've talked about, there is a very strong central government direction for council and many councils across the country to give effect to this intensification direction. So it's important to remember when providing feedback the matters that we need to accept and the matters that we can influence. So in terms of that, we can't change the government direction in terms of the legislation for intensification and the I guess the burden of proof to go through to build up those evidence, and also the streamlined process through the IHP in that condensed time frame. But we can influence how council is choosing or proposing, I should say, to give effect to the legislation in terms of, which qualifying matters we are proposing to carry over or introduce, and how much we intensify, beyond the direction that is made explicit in terms of intensification, and where we've applied that discretion and how we've interpreted the evidence that has guided that as well. So yeah, I'd encourage people when they are making feedback through the Have Your Say page, where the link is there, to just have a think about those matters that we can accept and those that we can influence through this fairly controlled regime overall. Next slide, please. So like we've talked about, there is quite a nuanced process for the housing and business choice plan change 14 to go through, which I've highlighted in terms of the independent hearings panel process, and having to go through that within a 12-month cycle and have that complete really by August next year. Really what that highlights, I think, is the importance to engage as early as possible, and not only through this process, but probably most notably through the formal submissions process. So you're included as part of that as well, just noting that that process for submissions is very tight, and that's by virtue, once again, of that direction for 20 days for submissions to be received, but also noting that any appeals associated with the decision can only be done on points of law. So it effectively skips the standardised process of going through the Environment Court, and so points of law would have to go to the High Court as well. So there's a fairly high degree of a burden, I guess, on appellants to go through that process. And this really contrasts to the process that we have through the Heritage Plan Change, through Plan Change 13. And this is really what we would call the standard Schedule 1 plan change process, which is defined by the Act. And so we do have more flexibility around that. I guess the main point for people to realise is that the intention is that both plan changes would be notified at the same time to ensure that the heritage aspects that are relevant to qualifying matters are captured as part of the housing and business choice plan change. But in terms of having an influence on those controls, there are 2 separate pathways for that as well, which are outlined separately there for the engagement material on plan change 13 and 14 respectively. Next slide, please.
Ike, I wonder if I could ask a question, please, that's just come through on email, and it's just around, understand from the seminar that we won't know what the new rules built for form standards within the RHAs are until the notification period being August 2022, and the operative district plan will remain operative within the RHAs until after the hearing process in August 2023. If so, I take it resource consent for any new buildings on site within an RHA would only be required once the new rule comes into legal effect after the hearings process in 2023. Is that correct?
Yeah, in principle, that is correct, going through that process. I guess the main thing to highlight is that as it progresses through the process, there's a different weighting in terms of legal effect of, having regard to the proposal versus actually having full legal effect, and that increases as you go through the process as well. Once a decision's been made, then it has greater weighting as well through the hearing process. But in principle, how that's been summarised is correct, yes.
Thank you. And we'll just do one final call for questions coming through on the Q&A or email. I realise we have got someone's outstanding in the email, and just to reiterate, the webinar will be available within 2 working days up on our website. We'll also have the full question and answer transcript, so you'll be able to see your question asked and our response to that, even if it hasn't been answered as part of tonight, or you haven't been able to see it because of the question and answer facility.
Great. Next slide, please.
So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And while we're not able to change the government legislation, we are really keen to hear from our residents about how you think our city needs to respond to legislation and to make it work for Christchurch. If you have any feedback about your experience tonight, we'd love to hear it. You can contact the engagement team about the webinar process. Or if you'd like to raise any questions about the project or have any more specific questions about the plan changes, please contact the planning team, and you can see their details there on the screen in front of you. So look, thanks again from the team here, myself, Ike, Glenda, Amanda, Sam and Karen behind the scenes. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to do this, and we hope you found it useful. Good night.